Welcome to Math 10 A&W with Mr. Sandhu. We are in chapter 1.5, doing example 3. This is on page 64 of your Mathworks 10 workbook. We're getting into some of the harder questions, and they're not hard because of the calculations that are required. They are hard because these word problems require that you really understand what's being asked. And there's multiple things that we're doing in one question. And so what we're going to do to start with is look at the words that are here and try to make sense of them. That's really the only challenge. The math itself is just using proportions, and you've done that, and you're good at that. Let's take a look at what's happening here. Anne works for an automotive parts distributor and visits Switzerland to source new products. On a given day, the bank's selling rate of Swiss francs compared to the Canadian dollar is 1.0501, and the buying rate is 1.0213. Let's just first see what that means. What does it mean to have a bank selling rate and a bank buying rate? In previous questions, you only had an exchange rate, one simple exchange rate that was written really clearly. You just use that exchange rate to do your work, and it was quite straightforward. In this question, they've given you two exchange rates, and they're not entirely clear what they are. For instance, if you take a look, right here, it says the Swiss franc compared to the Canadian dollar is 1.0501. And buying rate is 1.0213, and they don't tell you what this is. Is this Swiss francs? Is this dollars? This one here says compared to Canadian dollars is 1.0501. So I'm going to assume that's Canadian dollars, but this one it doesn't say. So let's get an understanding here. We're going to use the pen to fill in some missing information here. So on a given day, the bank selling rate of the Swiss franc. So instead of the Swiss franc compared to the Canadian dollar, I'm going to write 1 Swiss franc. Okay, let's change this to a 1. 1 Swiss franc compared to the Canadian dollar is 1.0501. So we know that this is Canadian. Let's write that in. This is a very helpful first step because you can visually see what's happening. All right, I think I can write a conversion rate. I can say that the selling rate is 1 Swiss franc compared to, or equals, 1.0501 Canadian. Let's write that down. So, bank selling rate is 1 Swiss franc equals 1.0501 Canadian. Okay? That is a conversion rate. Sorry about the messy writing. This pen's not calibrated very well. Fine, that's our sell rate. Now let's take a look at the buy rate. What about our buying rate? Okay, well, in looking at the buying rate, it says that 1 Swiss franc equals this buying rate of 1.0213. So if this is francs, this must be Canadian. I'm going to write that in there. Now that I've written some extra information in the sentences and put some symbols in, it's a little easier for me to see the information. I'm going to write the buying rate. So the bank buying rate is 1 Swiss franc is compared to 1.0213 Canadian. Now, I've got my two rates that I have extrapolated from the words that are written here. And once I've done that, that really is the difficult part of this question. From this point forward, we are simply going to do what we did in previous examples to do the calculations. Let's do the first calculation. It's saying how many Swiss francs would Anne receive for $400 Canadian. So I got a conversion to make. But the problem is I'm not sure which one of these two rates I'm supposed to use. So in order to go forward, I have to figure out which one do I use, and this is the easiest way in my mind. She has $400 Canadian in her hand. Let's just look at what's physically happening here. She has $400 Canadian, and she wants to turn them into francs. What does the bank need to do? Does the bank need to sell her francs, or does the bank need to buy francs from her? Well, she's got Canadian, and the bank needs to sell francs to her. So we're going to use the selling rate to do this question. All right, let's do it. So I'm going to use, just like in previous examples, this conversion rate here to convert $400 Canadian into Swiss francs. And since the bank is buying these, the bank is going to be selling us francs, we use the sell rate. Here we are. I'm going to say that let's enter our conversion rate in the form of a fraction. So we're going to say 1 Swiss franc compared to 1.0501 Canadian. There is our exchange rate. Over here, it's simply been written in the form of a fraction. That's the first step. Well, that's the second step. First, you want to write the exchange rate, then you want to write it as a fraction, then create a proportion as the third step. All right, let's look at what we have in the question. A, how many Swiss francs would Anne receive for $400? Well, this is the other piece of information we need. Now, Canadian is going to go on the bottom because Canadian is on the bottom on the other side of the equation. Make sure you label these so you don't get confused. Put the Canadian francs. Now, we want to find out how many Swiss francs we will get for 400, so let's put X. Okay? So it's X number of francs. If you want to, you can put Swiss franc here so that you remember. All right. This is a simple case of cross multiply and divide. So we are going to divide by the 1.0501 because it's across from the X. So we're going to have 1 times 400 divided by 1.0501. So that's going to be 1 times 400 is 400. 400 divided by 1.0501. Okay. So that means X in Swiss francs is equal to 380.91. Let's call it 380.92 because the 6 is here to round it up. So 380.92. There it is. And don't forget the units. Swiss francs. It's so crucial that you write down these units in these questions because there's a lot of information on the page and things get mixed up. So I think we've answered that question right here. How many Swiss francs would she receive for $400 Canadian? She would receive 380.92 Swiss francs for $400 Canadian. Let's do the second question. If Anne sold them back to the bank, how much would she receive? Okay, again, we've got two exchange rates. You might just automatically think, well, let's use the other one, which is correct. But how do we determine which one we're going to use based on the words? Let's read these words. If Anne sold them, okay, what's them, by the way? Sold what? It says how many Swiss francs would she receive? And then if she sold them. So we're talking about Swiss francs. If she sold the Swiss francs. So instead of them, let's cross that out. It's confusing. If Anne sold the Swiss francs back to the bank, how much would she receive? And how much would she receive in what? How much would she receive if she's selling Swiss francs? How much would she receive in Canadian dollars? Let's write that there. Now, these questions, in my opinion, are not very clearly worded. So that's why I'm taking it upon myself to make these easier to read. I'll try again. If Anne sold Swiss francs back to the bank, how much would she receive in Canadian? That makes more sense to me. So, which rate is it going to be? Well, if she's selling Swiss francs, then what is the bank doing? Well, these are the Swiss francs buying and selling rates. We've written them down as a conversion rate. I would say that the bank is buying Swiss francs from her. She's selling Swiss francs and the bank is buying them. So that tells me that we are going to use the buying rate here. Let's do that. Let's take this buying rate and write it as a fraction. 1 Swiss franc, the bank will buy that for $1, 1.0213 Canadian. That's how much the bank will buy it for. Now let's see what happens over here. We want to know what goes on top and bottom, and we don't have any information. We've got no other numbers in this line. We don't know what to put in. I mean, if you look here, we had a 400, so we knew that we had to put a 400 in. But in here it says if Anne sold Swiss francs back to the bank, how much would she receive? Well, how many Swiss francs? How many Swiss francs is she selling back? Well, that's the amount she converted right here. So she's selling 380.92 Swiss francs to the bank. And she wants to turn that into Canadian. So that means that 380.92 Swiss francs goes on top because the Swiss francs are on top. So 380.92 Swiss francs are going to be sold back to the bank, and we are going to receive an unknown amount of Canadian dollars. All right, let's cross multiply and divide. I'll just do it down here. X in Canadian dollars is going to be all right, so we are going to look at the X. There it is. We're going to divide by 1, and we're going to multiply the other two. So it's going to be cross multiply and divide 380.92 times 1.0213 equals, and divide by 1, which doesn't help anything. So we'll just leave it as 389.033. or 389.03 if it's rounded. So 389.03. All right. So that is converted back. And let's just make sure that I did that similarly. All right, so for question for B, 389.03 is what we have. I'm just checking to make sure that I have done it successfully. And there we have it. Now finally, in C, we want to know what is her net loss. So she started with $400. She converted that $400 into francs. Then she took that francs, 380.92 francs, and turned it back into Canadian dollars. She started with 400, and she's ended up with 389.03. So this transaction going back and forth between two types of money has cost her $400 subtract 389.03. So the difference between the two, I'm just going to ignore the negative symbol there because I've subtracted them out of order there. The difference is going to be $10.96. Well, we're going to round that up, $10.97.